We're human, don't you know, just like you. Welcome to season two. And is this the difficult second book or the triumphant sequel? Well, we'll find out. In these coming recordings, though, we are taking a leap into leadership and all of its complicated glory. So, leadership and dot, room for a variety of topics and perspectives to consider for your own leadership experience. And in this episode, we are discussing psychology and the role that plays. Now, my guest is somebody I have known and worked with for a year or so, and whose insights I value hugely. So, who is it? Phil Coley is an entrepreneur, dividing his time between his home in France and his business interests in the UK. He actually started his business journey at the age of 12, selling ad space in a village flyer. He's worked his way up and run successful businesses and now focuses on supporting business owners to scale up and succeed. Now, we're talking psychology, so it's only fair to really confirm some of our credentials so you don't sit there thinking we're a couple of hacks just talking psychology because it sounds good. For me, it's an MSc in behavioural change. And for Phil, it's a major in sports psychology. This has enabled him to work with Olympians and actually travelled to the 1992 Olympics, which gives away his age a little bit. So that is enough of me talking. Phil, welcome very, very much. And when we talked about you being a guest, you instantly went to psychology. I have to ask why.
I think for me, leadership is about psychology because it revolves around not just your own mind, it revolves around that of others. And psychology is understanding the person, the people, the situations, and all of those emotions that come in with it. And so for me, I jumped straight in because I have always had this passion for people and what makes people tick. And I think that's why for leadership is that understanding of what makes people tick. And I think for me, from an early age, I've always been intrigued what makes people tick. And for me, I had the privilege to play sport to a pretty high level. And I've been to Olympics as part of a sports science support program. And I've been revolving, my life has revolved around sport and business. But in the early ages where for me, success was less in academia and much more on the sports field. So I paid a really important notice about what was what and playing rugby and hockey, both to really high standards in two different positions. It was really interesting about what makes me tick, what makes those around me tick. And particularly when I went into roles of leader, both in sport and business as a captain or a leader or a business owner, I've always been intrigued by it. That's why.
Yeah, it's funny. I think there you've instantly touched on that importance of self-awareness in a leadership position. And I guess there's two things there actually on awareness I want to kind of query is the pros and cons of self-awareness. I was speaking to somebody the other day, a coachee of mine, who the more self-aware he becomes, the more self-conscious and concerned and anxious in some ways he's becoming because he's recognizing his both his strengths but also his development areas, and that's quite a kind of a painful shift in some ways. It's a little bit uncomfortable, it's a bit spiky, a bit itchy. So what would you say are the kind of the pros and cons of that raising of that self-awareness, and also how important is it for leaders to then have that basic awareness of human psychology?
I think it's hugely important to understand that level of psychology and understand how people are. And for me, I think the one thing that I would make really clear on my understanding of leadership is if you're a leader, I think what I found, you're not necessarily a team player. And I'd probably just explain that a little bit more. As a leader, you have to take those difficult decisions, and there has to be a real distance between you and the people around you. And I don't mean from a sort of a massive distance, but you can't in one way play the role of best friend and then lead. It's a really difficult one to do. And I don't think anybody can do that successfully because the psychology of it is wrong. Is ultimately somebody has to make a decision. And as a leader, you will have to make that decision. And a lot of the time, those decisions are difficult. And when you talk there about self-awareness, I think for me, it took me a number of years to realize I was a leader, but also to realize the differences of that. And particularly in my younger years, I would have been, and I was a bit of a rah-rah leader. come on, we're going to do this and that all, we're all in it together. But
Yeah.
when I then look at the psychology of teams I've worked with in the sports environment as a professional working with, it makes you understand everybody is different. And so the person who needs a kick up the backside could be different to the person who needs an arm around them. And that, as a leader, understanding the psychology of people, how people learn and how people operate emotionally, I think is super important to know and understand as an individual yourself, but also how others around you are.
Yeah, and shy of going out and getting an MSc in sports psychology or any other clinical or academic qualification. What are the options for leaders to really get behind that and understand the level of psychology that is practical and appropriate for somebody in business? Obviously, you're not going to go and become a clinical psychologist, but what's the level? What's that benchmark, I guess, of minimum understanding?
I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I think it's people operate on different levels and you need to understand what that is. And I think a lot of people in business are used to things like they hear the words like psychometric testing. I think that sounds fairly daunting, if I'm honest, to a lot of people. They're like, oh God, it's a load of babble. But there are good programs out there. There are programs out there that you can understand who you are. I mean, take DISC as an example. You can quite easily go and do a DISC profile on yourself, and that helps you understand who you are and how you operate, and it also helps you to understand how others might perceive that as well based on their styles. And I think look at things like that without going down any mumbo jumbo routes and just go, okay, that's a good understanding of who I am. So I think understand and look at that. But my number one through all of this is it's about relationships. It's about building trust. And somebody I know really well, we talk about this often, but it's also about, and I use it in my own training with people. I just say to people, write down 50 words of what you would like people to say about you. And some people go, 50 words, crikey, I couldn't do that. But I go, write down 50 words that people do, and then whittle it down to 5. What are the top 5 words you would like people to say about you? And then actually go, do they say that about me? If they
Yeah.
don't, why not? If they do, why? That's a really simple way that I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And you can test that as well, can't you? It's very similar to a technique I use, which is go and speak to 6 different people and ask for 3 words they would use to describe you. And it's quite tricky because those people will always say something nice, unless they're really quite brutal, because they want to be polite. They don't want to upset you. But actually, you do get some quite insightful things that you don't necessarily expect to hear. And it's
Yeah.
quite confidence boosting. But like you say, it gives you those words to hang off. Like, what does somebody say about me when I'm not in the room? That's what I'd like to be known for. And am I known for that? I think that's the third party feedback's really important, isn't it? You just reminded me, actually, there was a TED talk, and I wish I could remember the guy's name. I'm trying to dig it out and pop it in the show notes because I think it's worth a watch. As TED talks are great because they're only like 10, 15 minutes as well, which is always a bite-sized kind of chunk. And his 2 rules of leadership, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. The first rule is it's not about you. And the second rule is it's all about you.
I think for me, that is true. I mean, it is not about you because it should be about those around you. But I think and probably this is where I can touch back into the sports bit as well. And it's about outcomes, and it's how do you achieve an outcome. Ultimately, to achieve an outcome, if you're a leader, by definition, if you're a leader, you've got people around you, you need to lead them. And to be able to lead them, it is about them, but ultimately it is about you. So if you've got to achieve the goal or the outcome, they need to be on board with you. They need to be joined up, ready to go. We're off. We're going to do it together. So you equally then need to focus on the needs of those individuals.
Mm.
And if you look in sport more than anything else, so much in sport is about the outcome. If you look at Olympians, it's on a 4-year cycle. You've got one chance to get that medal, and that's the only chance. So everything is focused towards that. But in business, you're actually trying to strive towards outcomes every single day. And it's about the clarity in those outcomes. And for me, the one thing that you can learn from sport, which particularly over the last 20 years can be really seen in British sport, let alone other sports, is that phrase marginal gains.
Yeah.
And you can only get marginal gains by everybody collectively working together. And people might have one thing to work on, another has something different, but those 1% make a huge difference.
It's the 1% theory, isn't it? That little
Absolutely.
things add up to a lot. And I guess with such a variable task, because let's face it, leadership it's a thing to do, isn't it? I think a lot of people think it's who you are, and I kind of challenge that with actually it's a process. It's things that you do. Who you are is who you are, but a leader does stuff, and sometimes they have to manage, and sometimes they just have to roll their sleeves up and do, and sometimes they have to lead, and it's choosing when to do what, I think, is the real trick to true leadership. But those marginal gains pieces, like you say, it's those tiny things that add up to a lot, and it's being that conductor of which are those marginal gains, what are the things that could be most
absolutely. But I think when you look at that, I think, yes, a leader needs to lead and needs to give the direction, and occasionally does need to roll up the sleeves. But I also think the one thing one can learn from sport, and business fails at this a lot of the time, is in sport, the best sports person doesn't make the best coach.
No.
And doesn't therefore make the best leader. And if you look at, you can use football as a really good analogy, is football is so much a results game, as any sport is. But if you look at sort of that from a mainstream perspective, you look at great sports players, and only a small percentage can actually go on to be that coach or the director of football or whatever they are, and
do it well.
and do it well, and do it well. There are very few that can, because you're right, it's about processes, but it's also not being the best at what you are. You don't have to be the best to be the best leader, and that's what I definitely say.
You're right. Actually, you do see that a lot in business. As you know, my background's HR, and the amount of promotions we would witness that we wouldn't necessarily agree with, but somebody had been promoted because, I don't know, Bob counts beans. Let's just say that. And Bob is the absolute best bean counter there is in the entire organization. But because he's very singular, very focused, very driven, and all about the beans, not that peoply in that sense, is perfectly amiable, perfectly sociable with his colleagues, isn't what you would call a natural people leader. And yet, because he's the best bean counter, gets promoted to chief bean counter. So therefore, he's no longer actively counting beans. He is now helping other people do that in the best possible way. And it's uncomfortable for Bob. It's difficult. It's hard. It's not natural. He wants the pay. He wants the promotion. He wants the status. But he hates the job. And you see that so many times, particularly in technical expertise, so IT, finance, very technical roles, but also things like sales. You'll know this. Your best salesperson isn't necessarily your next sales director.
No. And actually, in most cases, shouldn't be.
No.
Because it's and any promotion, whichever department you think in business, is not only is it making it difficult for the company, you're making it difficult for the individual. So as you were saying, that promotion is not natural, because people won't necessarily decline the promotion because they are, in some cases, and they shouldn't be today, but some cases, people are concerned about their future. If I say no, what's going to happen to me? So people, wrongly a lot of the time will go, oh yeah, that's great, thanks very much. When inside they're hurting, it's not right. And that's when we talk about the psychology of people, is the emotions, the emotional stress and everything that goes alongside with it. So when I look at that, you need to look at the stress levels that are there, the anxieties that are created, because that has a negative impact on everything and everybody. So if you put someone into the wrong leadership position, and they're not right for it, emotionally, they're not bought into it, and emotionally they're suffering. And those around them will also as well be recognized in that and will be emotionally suffering as well. So you actually end up with a complete imbalance in the team. And then a lot of the time that person then is chastised for being not a good leader when it was not their fault. They should not have been put into that position. So I think away from the psychology of it is you should always be utilizing those around you before you make those decisions. And as you well know, Rachel, from an HR perspective, it's the evaluation of what is right for the individual and is it right for the business. So you'll understand from what I said then, is it right for the individual, and then is it right for the business? And that's where, as a leader, you've got to put the individual first.
Well, yeah, because absolutely, if you put the wrong individual into that role, ultimately it's damaging to the business.
Yep.
It will ultimately have a damaging knock-on, whether it's a case of its retention, whether it's attrition, whether it's, sickness absence, whether it's a lack of performance, whether it's, this shift in dynamic in the team means they're not delivering what they used to deliver because, in my Bob analogy, chief bean counter's gone off to do something that isn't their strength.
Yep.
And therefore also, you've not got your best bean counter on the job, so that's not being done particularly well yet. And also, they're moved into a role where they're not strong and so often not supported or given that education, given that extra bit of learning that helps them. If they do have some inkling of leadership potential, that isn't nurtured so often. It's just, oh, congratulations, there's your promotion, and pat you on the bottom and send you off to go, and off you go, metaphorically, of course.
Yeah.
But sending you off to go, just go and do the job.
And I think
where's my support? Where's my transitionary
Yeah.
help? My mentor, my coach, my mentor, my buddy, somebody in the organization that I can share with, whatever that looks like. It's so often overlooked because it's perceived to be either expensive or cumbersome or time consuming, and therefore it's not worth doing. And that is
true. That is true. But I think the other thing as well, when you look at that, is some people are promoted because they're the best at what they do, and it's the wrong move. Others are promoted because they're the loudest and the most vocal and the most outgoing. And from a psychological point of view, one needs to understand that. And not only have I had the fortune to do a lot in sport and work with some great sports people and great sports teams, but I've also been able to look outside of that as well. So I've had the ability to work with special forces as well and to understand what makes them tick. And when you look in that environment, not regular soldiers, you look in the special forces, most of them are introvert. They're not from an extrovert perspective. If you go into Hereford and you go and sit in a bar, the guy sat in the quiet in the corner, reading a paper, having a beer, saying nothing to anybody, is more likely to be SAS than the guy who's up there, who's Jack the Lad.
Giving it all that.
It's going to be, because that's what they select on. It's selected on the introvert, the calm, the grey man, as they call it. And the same can be said in sport, but sometimes in sport, and it does make me smile, is in the UK in particular, there is this focus on arrogance rather than self-belief.
Yeah.
And there's a real big difference between those two, where a lot of people roll them all into one, and they also then throw confidence in there as well. And when I look at a leader will have self-belief. They won't have arrogance. They will be confident, but the confidence is only as good as your last thing that you do. But it's the self-belief that makes a leader. And so there are lots of people who are not given leadership opportunities when actually they should do, because they don't have that external arrogance, but they have the self-belief. And that's psychology, is understanding the difference.
It is, isn't it? If you think about, you go back to the sort of 80s style of leadership, what I would call table bangers, that very kind of rah, rah, rah. And I say almost rah, rah, but it's not the, hey guys, let's go, cheerleading rah, rah. It's rah, like aggressive arrogance, cockiness, ignorance to a degree, but I'm in charge, so boom, 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 here we go. And I know that's been perpetuated through media and films and TV and all that sort of stuff, but I think there's still an echo of that hanging around in some ways. And actually, when you get into now the more kind of celebrity leader space, that assumption that to be a leader you need to be extroverted. And ultimately, like you say, you don't have to be extroverted to be a celebrity leader, to be out there, to be present on social media, to be visible. I mean, extrovert and introversion are very interesting topics, obviously, and they're ultimately it's where you get your energy from, how you refresh yourself, how you re-energize. That's generally the kind of differences, or the key differences. Not all extroverts are arrogant and cocky, not all introverts are shy, and that's just a really kind of generic. But it's really interesting how we still, in some ways, perceive leadership to be psychologically that you need to be the loud one and the one that's at the figurehead and the one that's kind of always out there talking, always out there speaking. And yet you can almost tell when leaders that aren't naturally inclined to do that, they may have self-belief, they may have confidence, but their inclination is not to be that face, but they'll do it reluctantly, maybe. What have you noticed is in kind of a shift in successful leaders that quite probably are more introverted. What have you noticed in terms of acceptance in the kind of the business world or the recruitment world or the kind of success levels of like the sort of businesses you work with that are scaling with leaders that are on that more introverted side of that spectrum? What have you noticed about their success rates?
I think what I do, there's probably, I've got a couple of comments on that one, to really bring it in and help people to understand it better than rather than just jump straight into the business bit. Is when you look today and go back to the 90s, if you go back into sport, and what's really interesting is I will always remember this from sports, from the sociology of sport, is that sport reflects the society that we live in, and that's very, very true. And if you go back to the 80s and just coming into the 90s, then yes, managers were shouters in sport. They were shouters.
Yeah.
And if you look today, and again, to make it relatable, I'm going to talk about two sports. If you look at football and the change, the Premier League is in the UK is seen as the league around the world. But actually, the majority of managers are overseas. And if you look at the success of Arsenal, and in the 90s, coming into the 2000s, they had Arsene Wenger as their coach. And when he first came into Arsenal, he brought in psychologists, dietitians, nutritionists, physiologists, everything, because he understood, again, marginal gains, but he understood there was not one rule for one and one for the other. And still today in the Premiership, you still have overseas managers coming in because they understand that philosophy. So the British game, and I say British game in football, the same in Scotland and Wales to a point, but very much in England, it's still around the shouty, and that doesn't work. It doesn't work. And when you look outside that then, and you look maybe to rugby, and Clive Woodward in the early 2000s was the leader in this, he was the one who brought marginal gains in. So he was like, right, we're going to go for it. And he made in 1999, he was like, right, we're going to target 2003. This is how we're going to do it, etc., etc. So those that would follow rugby would know that that would happen. And really interestingly, in the last couple of weeks, there has been the European Cup final in rugby. And La Rochelle have won it again. They've now won it back to back. And La Rochelle as a place, and not a million miles away from where I live here in France, but La Rochelle as a town, as a city, has only 60,000 inhabitants. And if you go back 20 years ago, who were La Rochelle? They were not a Toulouse of the world. Who were they?
They were a town. They were a town in a school
Exactly.
French book,
Well, there
Tricolore,
you
that
go.
we all
There you
knew.
go. There you
We
go.
all knew, but only from that book, not as a
Exactly.
rugby club, not as a. So where are La Rochelle now? What's happened this year?
So in terms though of that, is they made a decision that they were going to try and get their rugby club out of the lower leagues that it was in. So yes, of course, money plays a part. But the reason I say this, I was listening to Ronan O'Gara, who was ex-Ireland and played for Munster and won great silverware, and he is now coach of La Rochelle. So when he retired from rugby, he went to coach. He went out to New Zealand as well to learn from there. And interestingly, they've won again. They fought right back from a really, really tough game, and they came in and they won by a point. But he spoke afterwards, and one of the questions was, what's the difficulty leading this team? And he said, culturally, you've got lots of different countries. You've got lots of different players. You've got lots of different age groups. And for him to lead that team, it's about the individual and understanding the individual. So when you go back parochially 20, 30 years, the people there were the same culture. It's the same. Now it's multicultural. So if you think about a business setting, you have not just that from a multicultural. You have huge changes in age.
Yeah, you got the multi-generational workforce. Absolutely.
Exactly. And for me, I'm one of the people who grew up without computers. My first ever job was no computers, was just a telephone. And today you've got that whole thing. So as a leader and trying to get it right and trying to get it successful, it doesn't matter if it's a big or small organization. You have to understand those around you and all the small idiosyncrasies, not just of them, but of where are they right now in their career, in their life, in their generational piece. Where are they? So where I've seen success, Ale, is building the team with an eye on the future. And that comes from sport. That absolutely, my mindset comes from sport on that. when you set out with your team, or you set out on what you're going to achieve for the season or everything else, it's about overachievement. And it's about what's our 5-year plan. And yes, that does echo in business, but in sport, you're always aiming for the highest. So can we get to the Olympics? If we can't, can we get to World Championships? Can we get to European Championships? Can we get to national? And you come all the way down the scale, where too many people in business just go, right, okay, so how are we going to get through this year? What are we going to do? Oh, we just tick over. And I'm not saying people should have unrealistic aims, but goal setting is the foundation of sport. And too many businesses forget that.
And it kind of links back to purpose, doesn't it? It does link back, because I think with sport, it's a fairly simplistic purpose, isn't it? Either we want to be the best and we want to be there, and at whatever level that's at. In business, it might be we want to be the best, or it might be we want to beat our own previous targets or the previous performance and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, you've got a lot of variabilities, a lot of things you have to react to and be resilient to in order to stay the course. But that sense of purpose, that sense of this is where we're going. And psychologically, again, that has a really big impact on people coming to work in the business. If they know where the business is going, what they're doing, and why they're doing it, they're much more likely to engage. They're much more likely to believe in that cause and get behind it, in the same way as a rugby team will believe in the cause and get behind, yeah, absolutely, we want to target, the 5 Nations or whatever, the winning here or winning there, and whatever that goal happens to be. I'm just wondering about I love that we keep touching on the 80s and the 90s. And you and I are both children of the 80s and 90s. Let's not talk too much about that. But I keep thinking about this kind of the 80s, 90s style of leadership. It must have been absolutely so difficult for those on the more compassionate, empathetic end of that scale to get into and be in a leadership position. I think those that did it well had an exceptional amount of fortitude to be able to do that, and a little bit of luck, I'm guessing. And now I think tides are turning a little bit. I'm seeing a lot more in the kind of the social leadership kind of window that we've got to look at these things through. That you are seeing a lot more compassion and empathy and humility in leadership. Funnily enough, I know we talked about this briefly before we started recording, and I want to mention it just because it's a really fascinating insight into the different spectrums of human behavior and preferences as we go back to things like DISC. But it was Dr. Kevin Dutton's book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths. Now, obviously, the title got me because I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting. And in my head, this is just a slightly macabre interest in the psychopathy of the human brain. But actually, when you think about it, fearlessness, confidence, charisma, ruthlessness, focus are all traits that we do still encourage in leadership. Leadership training quite often talks about having that focus, having that confidence and charisma, and telling the right stories and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm thinking now, for any leader, anyone that's been promoted into leadership is scaling their business and suddenly has teams to inspire and motivate and engage, or is in a leadership position and wants to be better at it. That brings a huge kind of wrangle of, so who am I and what's my style? And we go back to authenticity and personality. How do I flex that best? What have you noticed in that spectrum? I mean, you've obviously worked with a lot of leaders in the past. We've been talking about introversion and extroversion, but in terms of sports people, leaders that you'd say, do you know what? I've worked with some people maybe that you would say were on that kind of upper end of the psychopathic spectrum, but not from a dangerous individual, but that lacking a bit of empathy, just my way or the highway, but at the same time fearless, confident. I joked to you earlier that I would, any time I ever had open heart surgery, I would want my surgeon to be a psychopath, because that focus and that fear of failure, I think would be absolutely confidence inspiring for me. The fact that they were horrid to the nurses probably at that point in time wouldn't worry me so much. It would be more about how determined are you to get this right. What have you noticed about leaders you've worked with in the past in terms of that spectrum and the wrangles that they have to flex to the other end when it's necessary to and when it's right to?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think being a leader is a challenge, and you have to be detached to be a leader. You just genuinely have to be. But outside of that, I think, everybody has a psychopathic tendency within them somewhere. Everybody does, and that's proven. That's a fact. But the phrase you mentioned there, which is just makes me smile, is fear of failure.
Yeah.
And the fear of failure is an inane human emotion. Nobody sets out to fail. Everybody wants to succeed. But if you find a true leader, they will find what somebody wants to succeed at and make sure they can succeed at that. So what you want to succeed at might be completely different to what I want to succeed at. And the measure of it could be completely different. And where I see it done really well is the measure of success is measured on performance, not the outcome. And all good teams, sport and business, is on performance. And the performance is on the small things, not the large things. And I've always been a fan of do the small things right, the big things just look after themselves. And that's where too many people get it wrong. They say, right, we're going to go and achieve this. You go, well, that's great. Well, where do you work back from? Where do you work back to and from with the people within there? So fear of failure is the biggest driver, and it's the biggest driver for anybody. It doesn't matter if you're a leader or you're not. Everybody is driven by failure. They do not want to fail, and whatever it is.
Yeah, and yet when you think about it, what's the thing we learn from the best?
Yeah, failure.
Mistakes, absolutely mistakes, isn't it? And and that lacking a fear of failure in some ways does encourage you to take some risks and to innovate and to try new things. And it is a balance, isn't it? It's a bit of a juggling act. You don't want to fail. You want to fail enough to learn, but not so much that it all goes down the drain.
But the bit
That in
I
itself
would,
is
but what I would say on that one, which I think is really super interesting, is sometimes people spend more time analyzing a failure than a success.
God, yeah,
and
absolutely.
you've got to analyze the success over the failure, because the success means it worked right. So how did that work well? Can you make it better? Rather than if something's gone wrong, well, it's gone wrong. Okay, you can learn from it. Of course you can, but you get the biggest learnings from the success. But people do not celebrate success and analyze it over the mistakes. And I'm like, that's completely wrong. So as a leader, I would be always analyzing what works really well, not what do we keep failing at.
Yeah, I've been talking to coaches lately saying, actually, when was the last time you dwelled on a success? Because we dwell on failure all the time. And we're programmed to. Neurologically, we are programmed to dwell on our failures so that we can learn from them. Memory exists, let's face it, to teach us lessons for the future. So, fire is hot. If we forget that, that's a bad thing. But yeah, ultimately, we're not programmed to look at our successes and do some navel gazing on our successes at all, because it's oh, that was nice, and you move on. You say, no, hang on, go back. What was it you specifically did that made that right, and how can you repeat that? How can you replicate that and do it again and again and again to make other things right? How can it work in other contexts? But we're not programmed to, unless we create that habit. So I love that you brought that up, because it's a bit of a pet project of mine. I wanted to jump up and down and say, dwell on success, for God's sake, come and dwell on success. We're not programmed to do it. We don't naturally do it. And yet leaders have a really good space to help other people do it by pointing it out to them. Like you say, encouraging them to succeed in the things they want to succeed in. So when they're kicking themselves, turn that around and say, but hang on, look, success number 1, you gave it a go. Success number 2, these things happened. And there's one small thing that went wrong in a catalogue of stuff that went right. And what are you now festering over? That one small thing that went wrong. What's the learning? Bag that. Now let's go and see what went right.
And I think when I go into the whole world of sports psychology, one of the key areas to really understand and look at is visualization. So mental rehearsal or visualization, because in the example you were saying, and this is something that people can actually go and do, is, if I say to you, don't think of don't think of a lemon, you're thinking of a lemon.
I'm instantly thinking of lemons.
You just are. And that's the thing. And then if you say, don't think about cutting a lemon open and slicing it and imagining that, you actually have a physical reaction to that. Most people.
I'm going to start going, I've just had my lips. Exactly. My eyes will start watering any second. Yes.
So people have that. So when I talk about visualization, is as a leader, either yourself or your team, visualization and mental rehearsal is one of the biggest things that people can do. And people underestimate this. And it's not about think and grow rich kind of philosophy. It's about actually, if I'm going to go and deliver a presentation, not only am I just going to rehearse it and go through my notes, but I'm actually going to close my eyes and imagine I'm looking through my eyes, seeing people in front of me, and I'm delivering it, because you can go through that emotional response. And it's worked for years and years and years in sport that people can mentally rehearse to get better and better. So people will go through something before they do it. They'll be at home going through it as well, thinking, right, I've got to go through this. And you see it in sports such as bobsleigh. You see it in bobsleigh where you get somebody and they can actually be eyes closed and they are going through each turn, the movements and everything. And what's been proven in rehab is a significant increase in rehab is through visualization. So if you have two groups, people who just have physio, people who have physio and working from a psychological point of view, but doing mental rehearsal visualization exercises, they are quicker to return than those that don't. And that's because every time we think of something, we do create a muscle twitch. And that starts to increase our muscle memory and go from there. So from a business perspective and setting, you can go through this. So when something's been really successful, let's try and relive it. Let's visualize it. What was it like? How did we feel? What were we doing? Great. We've reinforced that again and again and again. So as a leader, either for yourself or those around you, people don't tap into these things. They're actually pretty easy to do.
Yeah,
and
I'm
yes,
free.
there's compound free. Just
Totally
do
free.
it. Just do it. Because it's that ingrained piece. Because most people use 5% of their brain power. And again, that's proven. You're just not utilizing it in the way that you should do. And that comes from sport. There's so many examples, but in business, people are still slow to start to use those kind of things.
It all sounds a bit woo. It sounds a bit out there, a bit hippy dippy. No. There's so much now in the world of psychology, in the world of neurology, that demonstrates a lot of this stuff works. Meditation is not woo. Mindfulness is not woo. Yeah, that's a soapbox I could happily get on. We don't have time for today, so I'll stop now. Obviously, I am very conscious on time, and people's propensity to listen to things for a long time, because there's so much in this. We could go on for a very, very long time. It's a killer question, I guess, is really, what would you advise to somebody just being promoted? They've just moved into their first, what you would call leadership role, versus sort of stepping into team leadership, say management version of coordinating people, organizing workloads, that kind of thing. But actually a role where they're having to be a bit more visionary. They're having to engage people around a purpose, an idea, something bigger than managing the day to day. So we're talking about that difference between management and what we would perceive to be strategic leadership. What would you advise somebody moving into that new space who may be super confident, super happy that they're doing it, or they might be thinking, oh my God, this is a lot to take on, actually irrelevant of their mindset? What would be the first, there's so many pieces of advice I'm sure you could give, but what would be the first one you'd pick?
Build trust through clarity. Be super clear on who you are, be super clear on what you want people around you to achieve, and just be reliable, so people can rely on you. That to me is the most important things. Is don't try and be different to you, but just be credible, but be you. But definitely you've got to be clear and clarity. So I always go back to the greatest leaders give clarity, and through the clarity they give the direction. Even if direction is the wrong direction, everyone will follow through the confidence of their clarity.
Yeah.
And the rest will fall into place. And as a leader, if you make a mistake, you should be the first to put your hands up and go, do you know what, made a mistake on that, but it's fine. I've learned from it. We can all go forward, but I've made a mistake. So be human. And that's really interesting, as you talk about being human all the time.
I do. I was actually, should I add that in now? But no, I'm pretty sure Phil's going to get there. That's where you're heading for. You're right. It is accept that you are human. You will make mistakes if you can own them. And again, that makes you vulnerable. It makes you real. It makes you. I love the word authentic and hate it in equal measure, because it's been overused in jammy, spammy marketing terms, be your authentic self and all that kind of stuff. What does that really mean? Ultimately, know that you are a human being. You are fallible. You are flawed. You are weird. You are quirky, and embrace all of that and lead. That's That's the key to it, isn't it? And you can, as it from any position, lead.
Yeah.
Let's face it, we see
Totally.
leaders at all levels. Thank you so much for that. That's been absolutely brilliant. And there's, I think, so much more Phil could share and does share. I know very much how much stuff you put out in the world that is free to access, no spammy sales funnels or anything like that, which is what I do love about you, Phil. Do give us, this is the time in the podcast that I do invite my guests to do a shameless plug for their businesses. So do tell us what it is you and your business do, who you do it for, and how we can get in touch with you.
Perfect. People can find me on LinkedIn, Phil Coley, Business Plus Group. Find me on LinkedIn really quickly, easily. Do connect with me. But equally, it's not just about Business Plus Group. What is it? So we've got a sales marketing agency. We also have a payroll and bookkeeping bureau. So myself and my business partner, and we are working with businesses that are startups, scale-ups, and sell-ups, helping them to get sales right, get their numbers right. And for me as an individual now, amazing team around me, we work really strong, but it allows me to do what I do best, which is sales coaching. So help people to get clear direction in their sales, to help them go forward and give them a very gentle kick up the backside when they need it to make sure they're accountable. There we go.
The loving boot.
Absolutely.
You are
Absolutely.
a loving boot. Yes, you have given me a kick at the bum a couple of times, and I very much appreciate that. Thank you so much to Phil for being here and sharing this with us. I think it's been absolutely brilliant. If you liked this, know that you liked this. Hit the subscribe button from wherever you're listening. Certainly on YouTube, there's definitely one, and also whichever platform you happen to be listening from. I will put Phil's social links onto the show notes, so you will be able to click those and get straight through to the website and the LinkedIn connection requests and all that kind of stuff. So do connect with Phil, because he does put a lot of stuff out for nothing, I've got to say. Lots and lots of free advice out there from Phil, and him and his team are totally worth working with. I'm not biased at all, obs, but there we go. So thanks for listening, and we'd love to have you back again next time. And until then, toodaloo.